There's this image I keep coming back to when I think about the MCU multiverse. It's not a battle scene. It's not some enormous CGI spectacle with cities falling apart in the background. It's just a man, or whatever he is exactly, standing at a window the size of a galaxy, watching. That's the Watcher. Uatu, a cosmic being so old and so powerful that the entire multiverse fits in his field of view, and all he does with that vantage point is observe. Just watches, takes no notes, interferes with nothing, just stands there in his enormous observatory at the edge of everything, while infinite versions of infinite stories play out below him. I find that image genuinely calming, honestly. The idea that somewhere out there, all of this is being witnessed, every version of every story, every universe where things went differently, someone, something, is keeping an eye on all of it. And it's not panicking, it's not trying to fix anything, it's just there. That's roughly the energy I want for tonight. We're going through the MCU Multiverse universe by universe. Not rushing, not ranking them or arguing about which ones matter most. Just visiting each one in turn, spending a bit of time there, looking around, and then moving on. There's a lot to cover. The main universe, the alternate realities that got folded in from films that technically predated this version of Marvel. The animated pocket dimensions from What If, the worlds glimpsed through shattered spells and fractured mirrors, all of it. Now, the multiverse wasn't always the point of the MCU. For the first decade or so of these films, the Infinity Saga, if you want to use the official terminology, everything happened in one universe. One continuous storyline, one Earth, one set of characters making their way from Iron Man in 2008 through Avengers, Endgame in 2019. That was the deal. It was a big interconnected story, but it was still just one story. Then Loki happened. Then Spider-Man, No Way Home. Then Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and What If, and Deadpool, and Wolverine, and the Fantastic Four. And honestly, at some point you look up, and the MCU is no longer one story set in one universe. It's an architecture. An enormous, sprawling, occasionally contradictory structure where the same character can exist in hundreds of different forms across hundreds of different realities, and a single bad spell can pull half a dozen of them into the same room. It's a lot to hold in your head all at once, which is fine because tonight we're not holding it all at once. We're doing it one universe at a time, in no particular hurry, the way you'd flip through a photo album rather than read a textbook. And if you want to subscribe before we start, I genuinely appreciate it. It's the easiest way to make sure future nights like this find their way to you. But either way, settle in, get comfortable. We've got a lot of worlds to visit, starting as always with home. Here's a fun piece of trivia that caused a genuinely embarrassing amount of discourse online when it was confirmed. The main MCU universe is called Earth 616. The reason this caused discourse is that Earth 616 is also the designation for the primary Marvel Comics universe. The comics fans felt that was sloppy. If the MCU is an adaptation of the comics, they argued, it should have its own designation. Earth 9999, which was what Marvel Comics had actually assigned to the MCU setting back in 2008, in an official handbook. Two different universes, tidy, separate. And then Mysterio, Quentin Beck, the villain of Spider-Man Far From Home, claimed to be from an alternate universe called Earth 833, which made our universe Earth 616, and everyone got briefly excited about the implications, until it turned out Mysterio was lying about literally everything, including that. He wasn't from another universe at all. He was just a disgruntled Stark Industries employee with a lot of projection technology and a grudge. So Earth 616 as a name was a misdirection wrapped in a lie, and then Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness went and made it official anyway. Earth 838's Christine Palmer, a multiversal expert in that universe, refers to Strange's home dimension as Earth 6 or 16, and that stuck. Marvel went with it. Kevin Feige confirmed it. Earth 616 it is. Which, honestly, fine. It makes a certain poetic sense. The MCU is an adaptation of the Marvel Comics universe. Why not share the name? They're both the main event, anyway. Earth 616 is where everything starts, and it's worth taking a moment to actually think about what this universe is. What makes it the anchor point for the Multiverse Saga, what it contains, and how it became the one that everything else orbits. This is the universe where Tony Stark built a suit in a cave with a box of scraps and decided it was worth doing something with. Where Steve Rogers, a genuinely tiny man from Brooklyn who couldn't quite pass the physical for the army, got the super soldier serum and spent decades frozen in ice before waking up in a world that had moved on entirely without him. Where Thor, a Norse god of thunder, crash-landed in a small New Mexico town and had his hammer taken away from him because he'd been arrogant and needed to learn something. Those are the foundation stones. 3 very different people, an engineer, a soldier, a god, none of whom particularly wanted to share space with the others, who ended up assembled by Nick Fury in 2012 to fight an alien invasion. They managed it, barely, with a great deal of infighting and exactly 1 moment of genuine teamwork at the end. From there, Earth 616 kept expanding, Guardians of the Galaxy, Wakanda revealing itself to the world, the Sokovia disaster, all of it building toward Thanos, arriving with 6 stones, and a plan that was, by any measure, completely insane in scope and somehow nearly worked. 5 years of grief, adjustment, and impossible gardening followed, and then the Avengers reversed it. The time heist, the second snap, the return of everyone who'd been lost at a cost that included Tony Stark dying in a field in upstate New York, surrounded by people who loved him. What makes Earth 616 interesting as a universe beyond its specific history is its position in the multiverse structure. For a long time, it was protected. He who remains, the man at the end of time running the TVA, kept it stable. He pruned any branching timeline that deviated significantly from the sacred timeline, which was essentially Earth 616 extended into infinity. He killed the multiverse for the sake of this one universe, over and over, for centuries, without anyone in the universe being aware of it. That's a strange thing to sit with. Every divergence from Earth 616's history was erased, every alternate path closed off. The events of the Infinity Saga, every sacrifice, every victory, every loss, happened in a universe that was, by design, the only one allowed to exist. Until Sylvie killed He Who Remains, anyway. The other thing worth noting about Earth 616 is how normal it is, relative to what we'll be visiting later. Yes, there are superheroes. Yes, there are alien invasions and reality-warping witches and men in iron suits, but the fundamental texture of this universe is recognizable. The coffee shops work. The football is still football. People fall in love and argue with their families and worry about their jobs. The weirder we get in later sections, the more that normalcy starts to feel like its own kind of extraordinary. Earth 616 is ordinary enough that extraordinary things stand out against it. In some of the universes we'll visit later, everything is so bizarre that nothing stands out at all. One last detail worth mentioning: the number itself. 616 appears in the Bible as an alternate reading for the number of the beast. Captain Britain's comics creator David Thorpe used 616 as the designation for the primary Marvel reality in 1983 as a deliberate joke. The idea that the universe containing all those chaotic, violent superhero stories might as well be a bit infernal. Marvel kept it. It's been Earth 616 in the comics for over 40 years. Now it's Earth 616 in the films too. The home base of the MCU Multiverse, named after an inside joke from a British comics writer in the early 80s, that got accidentally confirmed by a villain who was lying about everything. Feels right somehow. The Time Variance Authority has offices that look like a particularly committed 1970s government building, all concrete and warm lighting and wood panelling, staffed by people in brown uniforms who process paperwork about the destruction of entire timelines. The fonts are mid-century, The attitude is bureaucratic. The scale of what they're actually doing, monitoring and pruning every divergent universe in the multiverse, is so enormous that it can only be rendered legible by making it feel small and procedural. That's genuinely good design, honestly, making the infinite feel like a waiting room. The TVA exists, as we learn through Loki, to enforce the sacred timeline. The sacred timeline isn't quite the same thing as Earth 616 specifically. It's more like a bundle of timelines that don't deviate enough to produce a new Kang variant. He Who Remains discovered the multiverse, fought a multiversal war against his own variants across different universes, and won. His response was to found the TVA and ensure the war never happened again, by making sure no timeline that might produce a dangerous variant was allowed to survive. Every branching timeline gets a reset charge. The timeline is pruned, its people and events vanish as if they never existed. And the multiverse stays stable, and He Who Remains stays alive, and the war stays ended. The logic of his position isn't actually wrong, is the uncomfortable thing. He's not delusional about his own motives. When Loki and Sylvie finally reach him at the Citadel, at the end of time, he lays out his reasoning with genuine clarity. The multiversal war was catastrophic. Infinite versions of himself, all convinced they were right, all armed with technology that could reshape reality, fighting across all of time and space. He ended it. He's been maintaining the peace at enormous personal cost for longer than most civilizations have existed. He also acknowledges that he's a control freak running an authorial dictatorship over the entire structure of time, and that the only way he can be stopped is if someone kills him. He's practically inviting it by the end. Sylvie takes the invitation. She's been hunted by the TVA since she was a child, her timeline pruned for a divergence so minor that even she doesn't know what it was. She spent decades running, surviving, building her skills, and every version of her anger is about the TVA and the person behind it. When she finally stands in front of He Who Remains, she stabs him, and the multiverse opens. That's the moment everything in this video becomes possible. Before Sylvie kills He Who Remains, the universes we're going to visit don't exist. They're pruned, erased, collapsed before they can fully form. After that moment, the branches can grow, the timelines can diverge, the alternate realities can develop their own heroes and their own histories, and their own versions of people we know. What happens next, in Loki Season 2, is both more complicated and ultimately more beautiful than anyone expected. The temporal loom, the machine that processes all the newly branching timelines, can't handle the volume. It wasn't designed for infinite divergence, it was designed for controlled scarcity. As more and more timelines branch, the loom starts to fail, and entire sections of the multiverse tree begin dying. Loki spends Season 2 learning to time slip, to slide backwards and forwards through time involuntarily, then voluntarily, and the solution he arrives at is both simple and devastating. He destroys the loom himself. He goes back to the moment before it was built and tears it apart, absorbing the energy of every branching timeline directly into himself. He becomes the thing holding the multiverse together. He sits at the center of the multiverse tree, which in the final image of the show looks genuinely magnificent, a vast branching structure like an enormous Yggdrasil filling all of time, and just holds on. Loki ends by becoming a god in the most literal sense. Not a warrior god or a trickster god, but a guardian. He sits in the place. He Who Remains sat, but instead of pruning timelines, he holds them open. He nurtures them. He's alone, and he'll be alone indefinitely. And the look on Tom Hiddleston's face in that final scene carries about 15 seasons worth of character development. The TVA still exists after this. Under new management, Mobius, B-15, and the other agents who now know their variants freed from their real lives, it monitors the timelines rather than controlling them. It observes. It intervenes when something genuinely threatens the multiverse structure. But the era of compulsory pruning is over, all of which means that every universe we're visiting tonight is alive because of two decisions: Sylvie's decision to kill he who remains, and Loki's decision to hold the branches open. Without those two moments, the multiverse is a managed fiction. With them, it's infinite. The TVA's offices still have those wooden panels, as far as I know. Some things survive even the restructuring of the entire multiverse. Before we get to specific universes, it's worth spending some time in the place that isn't quite one. The void looks like the end of everything, because it is the end of everything. It's where the TVA sends timelines and variants after they've been pruned. Not destroyed exactly, but exiled. Compressed. Sent somewhere that exists outside of normal time, at the very end of the temporal sequence, where they can't affect anything. The visual is striking. Miles and miles of ruined landscape, under a bruised-looking sky, littered with the wreckage of things that used to exist. Buildings from timelines that died, objects from realities that were erased, the Statue of Liberty in the void, a Yellow Jacket helmet, a Thanos helicopter, a genuinely absurd Easter egg for people who remember a 1979 children's toy half buried in dirt. It's like a landfill for existence. What makes the void interesting rather than just grim is what survives in it. When you prune a timeline, you don't just erase it, you displace it. The people in it get sent here too, and some of them figure out how to live. The Loki variants are the clearest example. When Loki and Sylvie end up in the void in Season 1, they find a collection of people who are all, in some fundamental sense, themselves, but wildly different versions. Classic Loki is the one who stays with me. Played by Richard E. Grant, he's a Loki from a timeline where he actually managed to fake his death convincingly enough to fool Thanos, survived the events of Infinity War and Endgame entirely, spent years in isolation on an uninhabited planet, and eventually felt lonely enough that the TVA noticed him and pruned him. He's been in the void for an absurdly long time. He's made his peace with it, which gives him a particular kind of quiet authority. His moment in the season finale, generating an enormous illusion of Asgard to distract Alioth, using his magic on a scale he's never attempted, burning himself out entirely to give Sylvie and Loki their opening, is one of the better pieces of character work in the whole of the MCU. A Loki who survived everything by hiding, spending his final moment being visible in the most extravagant way possible. Kid Loki ran a bit differently. His branching point was that he killed Thor, which is apparently enough of a deviation to get you pruned. President Loki is exactly what he sounds like. Boastful Loki claims to have collected all 6 Infinity Stones at some point, which no one quite believes. Alligator Loki is an alligator. The show doesn't explain it. I think that's the correct decision. The Void also features Alioth, a vast storm-like entity that patrols the space and consumes anything it catches. It's less a creature than a force, enormous and formless, and utterly uninterested in reasoning or negotiation. The Void as a setting works partly because of Alioth. The landscape is already bleak. And then there's also a reality-eating storm somewhere on the horizon. In Deadpool and Wolverine, the Void gets revisited with a different population. The Fox-era Marvel characters who ended up there. Blade, Gambit, Elektra, a version of Laura who's connected to Logan, have formed their own grim community under the rule of Cassandra Nova. Charles Xavier's twin, who survived being killed in the womb through means the film doesn't fully detail, and has been building a kingdom in the landfill at the end of time. It's a strange image, all these characters from years of Marvel films that predated the MCU proper, all ended up in the same wasteland, all found each other, all being ruled by a villain from a comics run that the films only just got to. The Void has a weird kind of melancholy to it. Everyone in it was part of something once, and the thing they were part of is gone, and now they're just here. Sylvie's branch timeline belongs in this section too, even though she escapes the Void. She was taken by the TVA as a child Loki variant, pruned for a deviation so small she's never been able to work out what it was. She spent her entire life running through timelines that were about to be pruned, using them as cover, never staying anywhere long enough to be caught. The life she built was entirely mobile, entirely defined by what she was running from. Finding he who remains at the end of all that was supposed to be resolution. Killing him was supposed to be peace. That it complicated everything rather than resolving it is a very Loki kind of outcome. And Sylvie would probably be the first to admit it. There's a moment early in Wanda's assault on the Illuminati chambers that's genuinely difficult to watch. And not just because of what happens, it's the confidence. The Illuminati of Earth 838 walk into that room knowing they've handled existential threats before. They've fought dark dimensions and multiversal intrusions and a version of Doctor Strange so corrupted by the Darkhold that his incursion destroyed an entire universe. They have Reed Richards. They have Professor Xavier. They have a woman who has the power of a god in her hands and a shield that's held up against everything. And then Wanda arrives, and within about 4 minutes, every single one of them is dead. That sequence is doing something quite specific. It's establishing the scale of the Scarlet Witch at full power by having her go through Earth 838's greatest heroes, the way someone clears a table. And it works in a bleak, uncomfortable way, because these are people we'd have liked to spend more time with. Earth 838 is the one that shows you what careful world building looks like in a multiverse context. A universe with its own distinct history, its own institutions, its own ways of organizing extraordinary people, and its own very bad mistakes. And it made at least one enormous one. The Baxter Foundation is where we should probably start. In Earth 838, this is Reed Richards' organization, the scientific institution that acts as a counterpart to Stark Industries. It's where Christine Palmer works as a multiversal expert, and it's the body that designated our universe as Earth 616 in the first place. The Baxter Foundation exists alongside the Illuminati as one of the pillars of Earth 838's governance structure, which says something about how differently this universe organizes itself. Science and superheroes as co-equal institutions, rather than superheroes occasionally consulting scientists. Reed Richards, played by John Krasinski, a piece of casting that was simultaneously everything the fanbase wanted and a very clear signal that this version of Reed wasn't going to be around long, is Earth 838's premier scientist and one of its greatest heroes. He's also, characteristically, a bit too confident in his ability to reason his way out of anything. His attempt to talk Wanda down is thoughtful and genuinely kind, and she tears him apart while he's mid-sentence. His stretching powers are worth a note because they're rendered in a way that's almost playful. Elongated limbs, impossible angles, a visual language that's closer to the comics than most MCU films attempt. In the 30 seconds he gets to actually use them, you can see exactly what a proper Fantastic Four film with this version of Reed might have looked like. Black Bolt is the king of the Inhumans in Earth 838, and his death is the one that stayed with people. He has a whisper that can destroy mountains. Wanda closes his mouth. The ability turns inward. His skull, I'll let you fill in the rest. It's horrible in a way that's very deliberately calibrated. The power that was supposed to protect him is turned into the mechanism of his destruction, and there's nothing he can do about it. Captain Carter is Earth 838's answer to Steve Rogers, and she's been its greatest hero for the better part of a century. In her universe, Peggy Carter received the super soldier serum instead of Steve, became the world's first super soldier, and spent the decades that followed doing more or less what Steve Rogers did in ours, being extraordinary in circumstances that required extraordinary people. She fights well, and she goes down fighting, which is the most you can say for anyone. Maria Rambeau, as Captain Marvel, is the one that carries the most emotional weight if you've seen the main MCU's version of these characters. In Earth 616, Maria died of cancer before the events of Endgame, and her daughter Monica grew up defined partly by that loss. In Earth 838, Maria somehow ended up as the universe's cosmic hero instead of Carol Danvers. She has the same powers, the same role, a different origin. Her death in the Illuminati chambers hits differently when you remember what her daughter went through in WandaVision, even though Monica never meets this version of her mother. Professor Charles Xavier in the yellow hoverchair directly from the 1990s animated series. That sound effect as he enters the room, which is either a reference or the actual theme, and I refuse to look it up because I prefer not knowing, is the final member of the council to fall. He gets the closest to succeeding. He's able to enter Wanda's mind, reach the Wanda of Earth 616, who's buried underneath the Darkhold's corruption, make contact with her. And then the Darkhold Wanda breaks his neck while he's still in her mind, and Patrick Stewart's brief return to the role ends there. What Earth 838 leaves behind, after Wanda is done with it, is a world that has lost every single one of its greatest protectors. The Illuminati are gone. The people of this universe who had no idea any of this was happening are now without the council that governed them in secret. It's an enormous collateral consequence of one universe's tragedy spilling into another. The universe itself survives. That's worth noting. Wanda didn't destroy Earth 838. She just passed through it, catastrophically, on her way somewhere else. For all we know, Earth 838 is still out there, trying to figure out what comes next without Reed Richards or Charles Xavier to guide it. Maybe that's its own interesting story. Maybe someone's watching it from a window at the edge of everything, keeping an eye on how it develops. There's a moment in Spider-Man, No Way Home, where three people who are all called Peter Parker look at each other for the first time, and the recognition is immediate. No explanation needed, no lengthy establishment of shared context. They just look at each other and understand. It's a remarkable piece of filmmaking, that scene. It works because of something that has nothing to do with the script or the blocking. It works because everyone in the audience brings 20 years of personal history to it. Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker is the one you watched as a child or as a teenager, depending on when 2002 found you. Andrew Garfield's is the one you probably defended more than it deserved, while everyone else moved on. Tom Holland's is the current one, the youngest, the one who hasn't lost as much yet. Watching them in the same room is watching your own relationship with the character across different decades of your life. Marvel had nothing to do with that particular emotional effect. They just had the wisdom to put those three people on screen together and let the audience do the rest of the work. So, the Spider-Man universes. Tobey Maguire's universe, Earth 96283 by some fan designations, though the films themselves never specified, is the Sam Raimi version. Practical wherever possible, dramatically heightened, a New York that feels genuinely textured, lived in, full of extras with opinions. The films had a particular relationship with sincerity that was somewhat unfashionable, even when they were released, and has aged into something that feels almost radical now. They took the emotional stakes of being a teenage superhero completely seriously, without irony. This version of Peter Parker has been through it. His Uncle Ben. Gwen Stacy's death. In these films she died in a way the comics foreshadowed. Thrown from a bridge, the whiplash of the suddenly caught web doing what it did. Norman Osborn and Harry, and the impossible position of loving someone whose father you accidentally got killed. By the time this Peter Parker turns up in No Way Home, he's older, he's been doing this for a long time, and the weight of accumulated grief is visible in the way Maguire carries him. He also catches a pumpkin bomb with his hands in the final battle and absorbs the explosion. Just quietly takes the impact so someone else doesn't have to. Very much a version of Peter who has learned that being Spider-Man means giving things up. Andrew Garfield's universe, Earth 12703, roughly, is tonally different. The Mark Webb films were aiming at something more emotionally raw and awkward. Peter, as genuinely socially uncomfortable, brilliant and strange, and not particularly good at being a person around other people. Gwen Stacy in these films is a full character rather than a plot device, and the weight of her death in the second film, which this Peter Parker carries entirely visibly, is what makes his arc in No Way Home so effective. The moment that everyone talks about, MJ falls from the Statue of Liberty. Andrew Garfield's Peter catches her. He holds her, checking she's okay, and the relief on his face is so enormous and so specific. The thing he couldn't do for Gwen, done for someone else's person, in someone else's universe, that it lands on audiences like a truck. It doesn't fix what happened in his own timeline, but it means something. The villains pulled through the fractured spell are worth their own consideration because they complicate the usual superhero moral calculus in interesting ways. Dr. Otto Octavius, Alfred Molina, exactly as good as you remember, is a brilliant scientist whose arms developed a kind of malevolent sentience during an accident. He's not evil exactly. He's a man whose accident made him capable of terrible things. Doc Ock in the Raimi films is one of the genuinely complex Marvel antagonists, and Molina plays him the same way in No Way Home. Norman Osborn is a harder case. Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin has always been more genuinely unhinged than the others, and the serum that created him left two personalities sharing one skull, one that occasionally surfaces and is horrified by what the other one does. His sabotage of Peter's curing operation and his attack on May Parker are the hinge on which No Way Home turns. May dies reminding Peter of what great power requires. The grief from that is what almost breaks Tom Holland's Peter. The spell reversal is the part that still catches me. Strange explains that the only way to stabilize the multiverse, which is tearing apart as more and more people from other universes who know Peter Parker are pulled through, is to make everyone forget Peter Parker exists. Not just that he's Spider-Man, that he exists at all. Peter agrees. He talks to MJ and Ned, knowing they're about to forget him. He holds them, and then the spell takes effect, and the three Peters from three different universes go home. And Tom Holland's Peter is left in a universe where no one knows his name. He's the most isolated of the three. Toby's Peter has a world that's aware of him. Andrew's Peter has a world that grieved him. Tom's Peter has a city full of people who swing their heads up at the crack of a web and don't know why. He makes himself a new suit in a small apartment with no Stark technology, no shield support, nothing borrowed. It's handmade in the most literal sense. And he swings through snowy New York streets alone, which is about as pure an expression of the Spider-Man idea as the MCU has managed. True heroism as the thing you do when no one's watching and no one will ever know. The Ancient One doesn't give Stephen Strange a warning before she does it. She just places her hand on his chest and sends his consciousness flying. What follows in the first Doctor Strange film is one of the stranger sequences in the MCU. Magical Mystery Tour is what the production team called it internally, where Strange's perception gets torn loose from his body and sent through an increasingly incomprehensible series of realities. Eyes made of eyes, fractal structures, things that might be living, things that might be universes. It lasts about 90 seconds on screen and conveys more efficiently than anything else in the franchise the basic idea: reality has edges, and beyond those edges, the rules change. Doctor Strange is where the MCU's multiverse starts in earnest, even if it takes a while to develop fully. The film establishes that sorcerers don't just use magic, they access other dimensions, drawing energy from realities that exist alongside ours, sometimes passing through them entirely. The mirror dimension is the most used of these. It's a pocket reality that overlays our own, visible from within it, but separated like a glass box. Sorcerers can fight inside the mirror dimension without the battle affecting the real world. The visual language is that extraordinary folding geometry, buildings and streets reflecting and multiplying and origamizing themselves into impossible forms. that became the signature image of MCU magic. The practical value of the mirror dimension is exactly what you'd expect. You can have enormous, world-altering, magical battles without accidentally destroying New York, which has been a recurring problem in these films. The astral dimension is something else entirely. It's where consciousness goes when it's separated from the body, through magic, through near death, occasionally through sleeping at a desk while your body is technically still operating. Strange discovers it when the Ancient One slams his astral form out of his physical form in the car park of their first meeting. It looks like the real world, but more translucent, everything slightly lit from within. He discovers in a later scene that he can study in his astral form while his body sleeps, which has a nice quality to it. The obsessive student finding a way to learn even in unconsciousness. The dark dimension is where the film builds to its climax, and it's worth dwelling on for a moment because it's such an unusual setting for a superhero confrontation. Dormammu's realm exists outside of time. There is no time there, no sequence of events, no before or after. Just an eternal now, ruled by an entity of pure power that has existed so long, the concept of age doesn't apply to it. The MCU's visual interpretation of the dark dimension is appropriately alien. Churning energy, vast distances, no geography in any recognizable sense. Strange defeats Dormammu not through power, he's vastly outmatched in power, but by using the Eye of Agamotto, the Time Stone, to create a loop. He arrives in the dark dimension, is killed by Dormammu, the loop resets, he arrives again. He can die infinitely without the loop being broken because time is the tool, and time belongs to him here, rather than to the entity he's fighting. It's one of those genuinely creative solutions to a superhero problem. No punching, no clever gadget deployed at the last second, just a man willing to experience death on repeat until the thing trying to kill him gives up out of irritation. Strange calls it his bargain, Dormammu calls it a nightmare. Both are right. Strange negotiates. Dormammu leaves this dimension alone, and Strange stops the loop. Dormammu accepts, presumably because dying over and over in your own realm, at the hands of a human you've already killed 17 times, is bad for morale. The dimensions introduced in Doctor Strange's first film, Mirror, Astral, Dark, form the foundation of the MCU's multiversal geography. Everything that comes later, the more elaborate alternate Earths and branching timelines, is built on top of this original framework. Reality is layered. The layers can be accessed, and some of what's in those layers is very much not interested in being friendly. One quiet detail I've always liked, after Strange's initial tour through all those dimensions, the collapsing fractals, the entity eyes, the impossible geometries, he lands back in his body, absolutely appalled. The Ancient One sits calmly nearby. She's seen all of that and more. She's so accustomed to the vast strangeness of the multiverse that none of it registers as remarkable. There's something almost aspirational about that, I think. The multiverse is extraordinary by definition, but the people who spend enough time in it stop being astonished and start just navigating, which is approximately the vibe I'm hoping to achieve tonight. The first thing the Watcher says in What If is this: I am the Watcher. I observe all that transpires here, but I do not, cannot, will not interfere. He says it over an image of the multiverse that looks like an enormous constellation, infinite points of light, each one a universe, spread across a darkness that might be space, or might be something more abstract than space. He means every word of it. He will observe. He will not interfere. He's lying, of course. He'll interfere in the finale, but we'll get there. What If is an animated anthology. Each episode asks a single question about a divergence from the known MCU timeline. What if this one moment had gone differently? And then it follows the consequences, usually for a complete standalone story, occasionally connecting to others. The animated format matters. It lets the show go places the live-action films can't, more stylized, more extreme, less bound by the practical constraints of photographing a real environment. Some of the what-if universes feel genuinely alien in a way that live-action MCU rarely achieves, because the animation can just commit to visual choices without worrying about how to build a set. The quiet divergences in Season 1 are the ones I find most interesting, because they illustrate something specific about the multiverse structure. The smallest changes can produce the largest differences, and vice versa. Captain Carter's universe is probably the most grounded divergence in the first season. Peggy Carter stays in the room when Steve Rogers takes the super soldier serum rather than watching from a booth. She gets caught in a burst of energy from an interrupted Hydra attack. She gets the serum instead of Steve. She becomes Captain Carter. What's interesting is how similar her history is to Steve's, despite the change. She still fights Hydra. She still goes into the ice, or something equivalent to ice, a dimensional portal open to deal with the Tesseract. And she's still lost, for the better part of a century. The divergence changes the person, but doesn't change the shape of the story. Steve, in this universe, gets a Hydra stomper suit built by Howard Stark, essentially an Iron Man suit 7 decades early, which has implications for the development of that technology that the episode doesn't dwell on, but which are fun to think about. He's still in the war, still fighting alongside Peggy, still the person she loves. Just in a different configuration. Captain Carter turns up across multiple seasons of What If and in Multiverse of Madness. She's one of the few What If characters who gets a genuine arc across the anthology. The episode that introduces her is probably the most upbeat in the season, which makes it a good entry point if you're new to the series. T'Challa's universe is the other early season standout, and it carries a weight that has nothing to do with the plot. Chadwick Boseman died in 2020, and his final MCU performance was the voice work for this version of T'Challa. A T'Challa who was abducted by the Ravagers by mistake in 1988 instead of Peter Quill, taken to space, and became the most celebrated figure in the galaxy through sheer force of moral character. This T'Challa talked Thanos out of the snap. He convinced the Mad Titan that there was a better solution to resource scarcity than eliminating half of all life. The episode treats this as completely believable, and within the logic of the character, it is. T'Challa is a man whose fundamental gift is persuasion, not just physical power, not just tactical genius, but the ability to look at an adversary and find the argument that lands. A galaxy where T'Challa became Star-Lord is explicitly a nicer galaxy than the one we know. More cooperative, less violent. The Ravagers are essentially a Robin Hood operation. Thanos is reformed. Nebula has been liberated from the worst parts of her circumstances. The Collector is still strange and unsettling, but less threatening. It's the warmest episode of What If, and watching it after Boseman's death gives it a particular quality. The sense of one more story, one more version of a character that was simply not done being compelling. The universe where the Avengers died before they could assemble is the inverse of T'Challa's warmth. One by one, as Nick Fury tries to put together the Avengers initiative, the candidates are killed. The culprit turns out to be Hank Pym, operating from a place of grief and rage so total that he's willing to dismantle the system that failed his daughter. The episode is structured as a mystery and functions as a kind of inverted origin story. Instead of watching heroes come together, you watch them disappear. What it says about the MCU universe is interesting. The Avengers as a concept was always contingent. The right people needed to be alive and available at the right moment. Change one variable, and the thing doesn't happen. Party Thor rounds out the quieter end of Season 1. In this universe, Odin returned Frost baby Loki to his people before Loki could develop the resentment and loneliness that shaped him so completely in the main timeline. Thor grew up without a sibling, without anyone to compete with or be humbled by, without the specific friction that makes him develop into something interesting. He became essentially a very powerful, very cheerful person with no particular edges. He throws enormous parties. He brings the Ravagers to Earth for a holiday. He treats Midgard, Earth, as a party venue rather than a responsibility. He's not malicious, just catastrophically irresponsible. What the episode understands, quietly, is that Loki made Thor. The rivalry between them, the dynamic of Thor always being chosen and Loki always being overlooked, shaped both of them in ways they might not want to acknowledge. Take Loki out of the equation, and Thor is just a very large man with a hammer who's having a wonderful time. Captain Marvel has to try to stop him. It doesn't quite work. The episode ends on an ambiguous note that Season 2 picks up. There's a structural quality to the quieter what-if episodes that makes them particularly suited to this kind of late-night viewing. Each one presents a world that's recognisable enough to be comfortable, just altered enough to be interesting. You don't need to concentrate to follow them. You can let them wash over you. The universe of T'Challa's Star-Lord rewards a bit of close attention because of what it reveals about who T'Challa is as a person, separate from his role as King of Wakanda. In Earth 616, T'Challa's greatness is always partly institutional. He's the Black Panther, heir to centuries of Wakandan tradition, a man whose identity is so thoroughly bound up with his position that it's sometimes hard to separate the person from the role. In this universe, he has none of that. He's not the king of anything. He doesn't know he's Wakandan. He grew up with the Ravagers, rough and pragmatic and governed by the loose ethics of people who make their living in the grey spaces of galactic commerce. And still, he becomes the most admired being in the known universe. Still, he convinces Thanos. Still, he looks at a situation and finds the path towards something better. The episode is saying, T'Challa's goodness isn't a product of his circumstances. It's constitutive. It's who he is, regardless of the context he finds himself in. That's a quiet, generous thing for a 20-minute animated episode to demonstrate, and it does it without being heavy-handed about it. One detail that tends to get overlooked. Nebula in this universe is funny. Genuinely funny. Released from her father's specific cruelties by a galaxy that went differently, she's free to be someone other than the character shaped by abuse and competition. She has opinions about cargo runs and she makes jokes, and she has a hair situation that the main timeline Nebula would absolutely clock as ridiculous. It's a small thing, but it's a good reminder that characters shaped by their circumstances can be entirely different people in different circumstances. The capacity for humour was always in Nebula. It just needed space. The Party Thor universe also deserves more time than the first pass gave it, because the episode's comedy is doing something more substantive than it initially appears. Thor without Loki is a genuinely interesting thought experiment, and the show commits to the version of it that's the most uncomfortable. Not a darker Thor, not a simpler Thor, but an exactly as powerful, exactly as confident Thor who has never developed any of the restraint or wisdom that comes from having someone push back. Loki spent centuries being Thor's foil. Every time Loki schemed and was caught, Thor learned something about the gap between power and wisdom. Every time Thor was arrogant and Loki quietly undermined him, the same lesson came from a different angle. Take Loki away and Thor gets none of those lessons. He's delightful at a party and catastrophic as a guest. What the episode captures well, possibly better than the main films have, is that Asgardian warriors take enormous pleasure in destruction that isn't malicious. Thor's invasion of Earth in this episode isn't aggressive, it's celebratory. He wants to have a good time. The collateral damage is incidental to the fun rather than the point of it. Captain Marvel trying to contain him is mostly futile because he genuinely doesn't understand that there's anything to contain. He's not in denial about the destruction, he's just genuinely not registering it as a problem. The gap between his perception of what he's doing and what he's actually doing is the episode's central comic engine, and it works. What would fix him, implied but not stated, is consequence. Someone he loves getting hurt. someone he'd die for telling him he's wrong. He needs, in other words, something like what Earth 616 Thor got from spending time being human in New Mexico, from losing Mjolnir, from watching his friends get hurt because of his arrogance. He needs exactly the kind of experience that his uncomplicated upbringing never provided. The Hank Pym as the villain universe is the one that hits differently, depending on how much you know about Ant-Man's comics history. In the main MCU, Hank Pym is a brilliant but difficult man who built the original Ant-Man suit, refused to let S.H.I.E.L.D. weaponize the technology, and spent decades in embittered semi-retirement before recruiting Scott Lang. His daughter Hope takes after him in both gifts and stubbornness. The family's complicated but functional. In the what-if universe, where the Avengers are killed before they can assemble, Hank Pym's grief over his daughter, Hope died as a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, in circumstances he blames on the institution, is the engine of everything. He doesn't want to rule the world, or acquire power, or prove anything ideological. He just wants the people responsible for his daughter's death to experience what he experienced. The scale of the response is wildly disproportionate to the loss, which is exactly how grief works when it goes wrong and has resources. He's not calculating, he's not strategic, he's just a brilliant man in enormous pain doing enormous damage. It's one of the sadder episodes in the season, framed as a mystery but landing as a tragedy. Nick Fury at the end, facing the task of rebuilding an Avengers initiative that's now lost its founding members, feels genuinely alone in a way that the main timeline Fury rarely does. Not all of the Season 1 universes are quiet about what they are. Some of them announce it. Doctor Strange Supreme's universe is the one that stayed with me longest, and I think it's because it takes the MCU's most arrogant character and follows his particular kind of arrogance to its logical conclusion in a way the main films never quite do. In the main timeline, Strange's accident happens. He loses the use of his hands. He discovers magic. He becomes humblish through the humbling experience of his training. He makes mistakes but generally catches himself before anything catastrophic happens. He's the Sorcerer Supreme, and he's fine. In Strange Supreme's universe, Christine Palmer is in the car with him when the accident happens. She dies. Strange loses his hands and his person at the same time, and unlike the version we know, he can't quite move forward. He becomes a sorcerer. He masters magic. He learns about the Eye of Agamotto and time manipulation, and he uses those tools to loop back to the moment of Christine's death, again and again, trying to change it. The Ancient One eventually tells him what he's running into. Christine's death at the precise moment of his accident is an absolute point. It cannot be changed. The universe requires it. The more he tries to prevent it, the more reinforced it becomes, the more alternative paths to the same outcome the timeline generates. He doesn't accept this. He goes searching for power, consuming other sorcerers, absorbing their abilities, growing stronger and stranger and more desperate. By the time he's powerful enough to actually challenge the absolute point, he's barely recognizable. He's enormous. He's made of absorbed magic. The thing he's become in the pursuit of saving Christine is something Christine would never recognize. He manages to change the moment. Christine doesn't die in the accident. For a few seconds, the universe rewards his effort. And then it starts coming apart because he's moved an absolute point and reality requires one. Buildings collapse, time fractures, his universe disintegrates around him, and Christine. And the last thing he does is hold her until the universe ends. It's grim, without being manipulative about it. Strange Supreme's tragedy isn't that he loved someone. It's that he loved her more than he loved the idea that some things are fixed and the universe disagreed. He's still around, by the way. The animated multiverse doesn't give him the mercy of ending with his universe. He exists in the space between things, somewhere, having destroyed everything he wanted to protect. His redemptive arc, if you can call it that, comes in the Season 1 finale. The zombie universe is the episode with the most fun premise and the most genuinely bleak execution. A quantum virus from the quantum realm turns the heroes of Earth into zombies. Not slow, shambling zombies, but fast, intelligent enough to retain their powers, absolutely relentless. Zombie Iron Man, zombie Captain America, who specifically should have been one of the safest people in the world, but is not. Zombie Wanda, who is already very powerful and is now not burdened by the moral considerations that used to slow her down. The surviving Avengers, Spider-Man, Okoye, T'Challa, Hope Van Dyne, a few others, are trying to get the Mind Stone to Vision in Wakanda, hoping his technology can produce a cure. What they find in Wakanda is more complicated. Vision has been keeping Wanda alive by feeding her survivors. The episode doesn't resolve particularly cleanly, which I think is right. Zombie universes in fiction always have a problem. If there's hope, it feels unearned. If there's no hope, why tell the story? What if threads this by ending on something like a maybe, a fragment of possibility, surrounded by the implication that it probably doesn't work out? Killmonger saves. Tony Stark is the episode that rewards you most for knowing the MCU's history. It diverges from the opening of Iron Man. Tony's convoy is attacked in Afghanistan, but before the bomb can go off and send shrapnel into his chest, Eric Killmonger intervenes. Tony doesn't go to the cave. Tony doesn't build the suit. Tony Stark lives his whole life without becoming Iron Man. Killmonger attaches himself to Stark Industries, ingratiates himself with Tony, and works his way toward his actual goal, which is, as it was in Black Panther, access to Wakandan technology and influence over geopolitical power. He gets further in this universe than he did in ours because he has a decade's head start and nobody's thought to be suspicious of him. The episode ends without a heroic resolution. There isn't one available. Everyone who would have caught what Killmonger's doing earlier is in a different configuration, and the people who figure it out too late. It's an unusually dark ending for the show. A universe where the hero who might have stopped this was never created. Ultron Wins is where the season breaks its anthology structure entirely. In the main timeline, Ultron's consciousness was transferred to Vision's body before it could upload itself to the internet, which neutered his plan. In this universe, it isn't. Ultron gets the body, gets the Mind Stone, and within hours has access to nuclear launch codes. Within a day, the world is ending. He acquires all 6 Infinity Stones. He wipes out the Kree and the Skrull empires. He silences the universe. And then, in a moment that shouldn't be possible, in a limited animated anthology, he looks up and sees the Watcher. He becomes aware of the multiverse. He becomes aware of Uatu himself, something that shouldn't be visible to anyone inside a universe. And the Watcher, who has been narrating calmly from his observatory while watching this universe's everything die, has to run. The image of the Watcher fleeing from Ultron, from something he created by observing, something that became aware of its observer, is one of the better concepts in the series. And it's what changes everything. Uatu, for the first time in his existence, has to ask for help. Strange Supreme's universe is worth more time than the initial section gave of it, because the episode is doing something that the main MCU Doctor Strange films only approach. The arc of Strange Supreme is essentially the arc of grief taken to its logical extreme, without any of the usual narrative guardrails that prevent characters in mainstream superhero stories from going fully off the edge. The main timeline Strange has guardrails. He has the Ancient One. He has Wong. He has a structure, the masters of the mystic arts, the Sanctum, the responsibility of being Sorcerer Supreme that catches him before he can fall too far. Strange Supreme loses all of those. He discovers what causes Christine's death, the specific accident, the specific moment, and the loop begins. Each time he resets, he watches her die again. Each time he tries something different. He tries arriving earlier and stopping the car. He tries taking a different route. He tries everything a man of his intelligence can think of. And none of it works, and the Ancient One's warning starts to make sense in the worst possible way. An absolute point in time isn't fixed because the universe is arbitrary. It's fixed because it's load-bearing. Christine's death at that moment is part of the structure that allows Strange to become what he needs to become. Without that specific grief, in that specific form, he doesn't go to Kamatage. He doesn't meet the Ancient One. He doesn't become a sorcerer. He remains a brilliant surgeon whose only concerns are his hands and his reputation, and the world is undefended. Strange Supreme learns this. He learns it clearly enough that he understands the mechanism intellectually, and he continues trying anyway, because intellectual understanding and emotional acceptance are entirely different things. The power he accumulates in his search, absorbing other magical beings, each absorption giving him more capacity, each capacity used to push further into dangerous territory, is shown through a sequence of increasingly unsettling visuals. He arrives at each absorption point as something close to himself and leaves as something a bit more monstrous. By the time he's powerful enough to attempt the change, there's very little of the Stephen Strange who loved Christine Palmer left in whatever he's become. And then he succeeds. The moment changes. Christine lives. For a few seconds, they stand together in a universe that has bent to accommodate his will. The universe disagrees, quietly at first, then catastrophically. The moment that was load-bearing is no longer bearing its load, and the structure it was holding up, all of it, everything, comes down around them. Strange Supreme holds Christine as the world ends. He can't fix it. He used everything he had to break something that was holding the universe together, and there's nothing left in him that could reassemble it. He watches her dissolve with everything else, which is somehow worse than watching her die in the original accident, because this time he caused it. The Ancient One finds him afterward, the remnant of his consciousness, somewhere in the space where his universe used to be, and tells him gently that this was always where the path he chose led, that the absolute point was a warning, not a challenge. He spends the rest of the series in that ruined space. The Watcher eventually recruits him specifically because Strange Supreme has nothing left to lose, which makes him willing to break his own rules about non-interference in ways the Watcher can't. There's a version of Strange Supreme's story that's about hubris, a man who thought he could override the universe and was proven wrong. But the episode is more sympathetic than that reading. Strange Supreme isn't wrong that Christine's death was unjust. He's not wrong that a universe that requires a specific person's death to function is not a universe that deserves uncritical acceptance. He just doesn't have the power to argue the point successfully. The tragedy is that he had a great deal of power, just not quite enough. The Watcher's observatory exists outside of every universe. That's the only way to describe its location with any accuracy. It's not in space. It's not in the quantum realm, or the dark dimension, or the void. It's in the space between all those things, the gap between realities, where a being who can observe everything lives alone with the view. The observatory itself is simple, relative to what it overlooks. A vast chamber, windows, if they're windows, that show whatever universe the Watcher is currently watching. It's less an institution than a vantage point. There's no staff, no filing system. Just Uatu, standing, watching. He watches Strange Supreme's universe collapse. He watches the zombie universe spiral toward probably extinction. He watches Killmonger move his pieces into position on a board no one else can see. He watches Ultron acquire 6 Infinity Stones, wipe out civilizations, achieve a kind of omnipotence, and then look up, and Ultron finds him. The chase through the multiverse, the Watcher fleeing across universes with Infinity Stone Ultron pursuing, crashing through realities like a meteor, establishes something important. For all of Uatu's cosmic status, he's not a fighter. He observes. He's never needed to defend himself because no one in any universe has ever been able to see him. Ultron breaks that assumption entirely. The Watcher's solution is to go to the only being in the multiverse he's encountered whose situation might be desperate enough to make a deal. Strange Supreme. The man sitting in what used to be his universe, alone at the end of everything, having destroyed the only thing that mattered to him. They strike a bargain. Strange Supreme gets to do something useful. The Watcher gets help he's never needed before. The Guardians of the Multiverse are assembled from universes we've already visited in the season. Captain Carter from her World War II universe. T'Challa's Star-Lord from the galaxy he improved. Thor from the Party universe. Gamora from a universe glimpsed briefly but not explored, who defeated Thanos on Sakaar with Tony Stark. Black Widow from the universe where the Avengers never assembled. And Eric Killmonger, recruited because he's the person most likely to find a way to weaponize an Infinity Stone gauntlet. That last one doesn't quite work out. Killmonger being Killmonger, he immediately tries to use the situation to his own advantage, and Strange Supreme has to contain him in a pocket reality at the end of the battle. Strange Supreme stays to guard the prison. It's his penance and his purpose, and possibly the only meaningful thing left to him. The battle itself, against Ultron and his Infinity Stones, is chaotic and desperate in the way good final battles should be. Not clean, not triumphant, just a collection of people who've each survived their own catastrophes, trying to hold the line against something that should be unbeatable. Black Widow delivers the killing blow, essentially. She retains a corrupted version of the program that Zola was using in her own universe, uploads it to Ultron through his eye, and gives the Watcher an opening to imprison the armor and the stones. The Watcher returns everyone to their universes afterward, with one adjustment. Black Widow, from a universe where the Avengers never formed and the world has no heroes to defend it, gets placed somewhere better. A version of Earth that needs her specifically, a universe where Nick Fury is about to discover one unexpected ally has arrived. The observatory returns to its quiet. The Watcher returns to watching. He interfered. He said he wouldn't, couldn't, wouldn't. He did. And the multiverse survived because of it. I think the show knows that this doesn't resolve the contradiction, an entity that defines itself by non-interference, interfering. It just lets the contradiction stand, which is probably more honest than a tidy resolution. Season 2 feels different from the first in ways that are easier to feel than to articulate. Partly it's that the show has relaxed. It's less interested in retelling MCU origin stories, with one element changed, and more interested in going somewhere genuinely unexpected. Partly it's that the animation has evolved. But mostly it's that Season 2 seems more confident that its audience doesn't need familiar handholds at every moment. The episodes are more standalone, less interested in the connective tissue of the main MCU timeline, more willing to just inhabit a weird premise and see where it goes. Nebula in the Nova Corps is a good example of what Season 2 does well. This is a universe where Ronan's coup against Thanos, a coup we never see in the main timeline, but which clearly has some version of probability in the wider multiverse, succeeded in a particular way, shutting down Xandar and leaving the Nova Corps in a compromised position. Nebula, in this universe, never went through her main timeline arc of abuse, competition, and eventual redemption. She ended up in law enforcement. She is, by this universe's standards, one of the good ones. The episode plays as Noir, Nebula investigating a conspiracy within the Nova Corps, uncovering something bigger than she was looking for, moving through a visual palette that's darker and more textured than most MCU animation. It works as a standalone story. You don't need to know where the main timeline Nebula ended up to enjoy it. Iron Man on Sakaar is the episode that stays with me from Season 2 because it's built around a melancholy premise. In the main MCU, Tony Stark flies a nuclear weapon through the portal above New York during the Chitauri invasion and comes back through at the last second. In this universe, he doesn't come back. He goes through the portal and ends up on Sakaar, the garbage planet, the gladiatorial spectacle, the place Thor winds up in Ragnarok. Tony Stark ends up on Sakaar and doesn't become Iron Man. The Avengers don't fully cohere without him. The world survives the Chitauri invasion, probably, but the genius who'd have built defenses against the next one isn't there. On Sakaar, Tony meets Valkyrie and Korg, and the episode becomes a slightly absurdist story of survival, and eventually something like a new purpose. Tony saves Sakaar from the Grandmaster, which is not nothing, and eventually he teams up with a version of Gamora and deals with the Mad Titan. His universe saves some lives, even if it's not his universe. The emotional register is unusual for a superhero story. This is a version of Tony who got a second chance at a quieter heroism, in a world that doesn't know his name and wouldn't care if it did. He's not building Iron Man suits, he's not the futurist, he's just a man in impossible circumstances who's still, despite everything, constitutionally unable to stop trying to help. Kahori is the most genuinely original episode What If has produced in either of its first 2 seasons. An entirely new character, Kahori, a young Mohawk woman in pre-colonial America, in an entirely new universe where the Tesseract crash-landed in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy before European colonization. In this universe, European colonization doesn't happen. The energy of the Space Stone protects and empowers the indigenous people of that land. Kahori gains abilities connected to the Tesseract and has to figure out what to do with them in a world that has no framework for what she is. The episode was developed with indigenous consultants and is careful about how it handles the cultural specifics. It's also, in a fairly quiet way, a genuinely unusual premise for a Marvel production. A story that treats indigenous survival and self-determination as the default rather than the exception. Where the history of North America went differently because one cosmic object landed somewhere different. Kahori returns in the Season 2 finale and in Season 3, which suggests Marvel is genuinely committed to the character rather than using her as a one-episode novelty. Good. She's one of the better original additions to the MCU's animated space. The Strange Supreme Collecting Universe Killers episode at the end of Season 2 is where the show's connective tissue reasserts itself. Strange Supreme, still in his lonely vigil since the Season 1 finale, has found a purpose, locating beings who have destroyed their own universes, universe killers, in TVA terminology, and containing them. Penance without absolution. He recruits Captain Carter to help him, and what they uncover suggests that his plan is more complicated than simple redemption. He's gathering these universe killers for a specific purpose, to use their energy to try to restore his destroyed universe, which raises questions about whether his arc is redemption or just the same obsession in a different frame. The episode introduces the multiverse tree from Loki Season 2 into the animated continuity, the vast branching structure that Loki is holding open. It's a visual callback that suggests these apparently separate parts of the franchise are aware of each other, which is a relatively neat piece of connective work. The Happy Hogan Saves Christmas episode is, by any objective measure, completely unserious. It knows this, it leans into it. A world where Darren Cross's Yellow Jacket suit is being used to ruin a Stark Industries Christmas party, and the only person available to save it is Happy Hogan, Tony's driver and head of security, a man of middling combat skills and enormous stubbornness, is a premise built entirely on the comedy of the wrong person in the right situation. What the episode gets right is Happy himself. Jon Favreau has played this character with real affection across many films, and the animated version captures the specific energy of a man who is absolutely not a superhero, who knows he's not a superhero, who nevertheless refuses to step aside when something needs doing. Happy Hogan is the MCU's most durable supporting character precisely because he doesn't have powers or special abilities. He just shows up consistently and cares. The episode is a palate cleanser. After several consecutive what-if episodes dealing with universe-scale catastrophe, the stakes of one bad Christmas party feel almost pleasant. The villain loses. The party is saved. Happy Hogan is briefly and correctly celebrated and then immediately returned to obscurity. It's fine. It's quietly charming. The Hela Finds the Ten Rings episode is substantially less cozy. In the main MCU, Hela was imprisoned in Hell by Odin, after she and Odin grew apart on the question of whether conquest was a policy or an identity. She spent millennia there, accumulating rage, waiting. In this universe, her imprisonment takes her somewhere different. She finds Shu Wenwu's ancient rings, the artifacts that have allowed him to build dynasties for thousands of years. Two ancient powers with complementary ambitions, meeting in a universe that didn't protect itself adequately against either one of them separately, let alone together. The episode is interesting because it refuses to make either character the straightforward villain. Hela wants recognition. Shu Wenwu wants to be understood. Both of them have spent incomprehensible amounts of time being misunderstood by people who feared them, and their initial dynamic is less conflict than collision of fundamentally similar damage. The fact that this quickly escalates into enormous destruction is not quite a surprise. What's left after the episode ends is the implication of a universe that has two of the most powerful beings in any reality's history now coexisting, having apparently negotiated some kind of arrangement. What that arrangement looks like long-term, the episode doesn't say. It ends on a note of uneasy possibility, which is appropriate. Not all universes resolve cleanly. The Kahori episode deserves additional time because of what it represents structurally. Most what-if episodes are variations on existing MCU narratives. Captain Carter is a Peggy-substituted version of Captain America. The first Avenger, T'Challa's Star-Lord, is a T'Challa-substituted version of Guardians of the Galaxy. Strange Supreme is a Christine Death-altered version of Doctor Strange. The starting point is always a known story with one element changed. Kahori has no known story to vary from. She's built from the ground up, a character who would exist in a universe where European colonization of North America didn't happen because the Tesseract landed in Haudenosaunee territory, and the energy it provided changed the outcome of every encounter that followed. She's not a variant of anyone. She's entirely herself. The episode was developed in consultation with indigenous writers and cultural consultants, which shows in the specificity of its cultural grounding. This isn't a generic pre-colonial Native America setting. It's Haudenosaunee culture specifically, with specific traditions and specific relationships with land and power. The MCU doesn't always do this level of care, and when it does, the results are better for it. Kahori's powers, connected to the Tesseract's space stone energy, are visually distinct from anything else in the MCU's magic vocabulary. She's not using sorcery or technology. She's using something that predates both, something the universe made available specifically because of where and when the Tesseract fell. The episode's argument, quietly made, is that the power was always available to the people who'd been displaced from it. The cosmic object just needed to land in the right hands. Season 3 knows it's the last one. There's a different quality to the episodes. Not heavier exactly, but more ambitious. The roster of characters is larger than either previous season. The premises are stranger, more genre-fluid, less anchored to specific MCU touchstones. It's a show that's been given permission to try things it couldn't try when it was still establishing itself. The finale is also, by necessity, a finale for the whole animated project, which means Season 3 has to do two things at once. Tell its individual stories with the same energy the earlier seasons brought to theirs, and find an ending that feels like something. The Mech Avengers universe is where Season 3 opens, and it establishes the season's appetite for scale almost immediately. This is a universe where Bruce Banner's attempt to cure the Hulk went catastrophically wrong. Rather than producing a man who could function without the Hulk, the experiment produced something worse. A version of the Hulk condition, so extreme that Banner became the apex, and enhanced being capable of creating gamma beasts, creatures of enormous destructive power. The original team of Avengers, the ones we know, were killed in what the episode calls the Gamma War. Gone. The world survived, but barely, and it survived into something darker than what we know from Earth 616. The second generation of heroes took up the mantle in a different way. Working from Tony Stark's archived Hulkbuster technology, they built something bigger. Full suits of powered armor, teams working in coordination, a different kind of Avenger. Sam Wilson's Captain America leads this group. It's a version of Sam whose arc we know from the main MCU, a man who took up the shield, knowing what it meant and what it asked of him, translated into a context where the original Avengers are history and the new team is still figuring out what they are. The visual distinction works because of the animated format. Hulkbuster scale armor is straightforward enough to build in a real production. Filling an entire team with it requires the kind of scope that animation handles, without the budget implications. Storm as Goddess of Thunder is the other Season 3 episode that landed most clearly from what's been shown. A universe where the role that Thor played, the Asgardian warrior exiled to Earth, learning humility through loss, is occupied by Aurora Munro, Storm. The concept is elegant because it doesn't require much modification to make it work. Aurora Munro already commands weather and lightning. She's already, in comics terms, a goddess of elemental power. Giving her Mjolnir and the Asgardian mythological framework behind it is less a departure than a different angle on the same character. What the episode seems interested in, from what's been shown, is the crossing of two mythological traditions. Asgardian cosmology meeting African spiritual traditions. The MCU's comic book pantheon meeting a character whose own cultural background is rich enough to complicate it. Whether it pulls that off with the care it requires, I'll leave for you to judge when you see it. Captain Carter returns again in Season 3, which at this point makes her the what-if protagonist in the same way Tony Stark is the Infinity Saga protagonist. Not every story is hers, but she's the connecting thread. Her arc across 3 seasons amounts to something like a found purpose, a woman who was displaced from her own time, her own universe, who has spent the years since being genuinely useful in other people's crises. Kahori returns alongside her, which feels right. The two of them together represent what the animated space has been reaching for. Characters who exist in the multiverse not as alternate versions of known heroes, but as their own people who happen to inhabit it. The finale draws everything together in a way that connects back to the multiverse tree, to Loki's sacrifice at the end of his show, to Strange Supreme's vigil. It's an ending for the anthology, which means it has to honour the scale of what the show has been doing across 3 seasons. Dozens of universes, hundreds of variations, an animated space that proved you can make serious MCU storytelling without it being live action. What If exists in an interesting position in the overall multiverse architecture. Its universes are technically as real as Earth 838 or the Spider-Man universes. They're branches on the same tree that Loki is holding open. Strange Supreme's destroyed universe was destroyed, not simulated. Captain Carter's displacement is genuine displacement. The Guardians of the Multiverse assembled from real alternate realities, but they exist at one remove from the live-action films, and audiences tend to weight them differently. The death of Earth 838's Reed Richards feels different from the death of Doctor Strange Supreme's universe, even though the latter is objectively more total. That's a quirk of medium, not of the franchise's internal logic. The multiverse doesn't make those distinctions. For the watcher, all of it is real, and all of it is equally worth watching. The Eternals universe adaptation in Season 3 represents one of the show's most ambitious genre departures. The Eternals in the main MCU exist in a strange position. They've been on Earth for 7,000 years. They've watched civilizations rise and collapse. They're genuinely ancient in a way that the other Avengers aren't. And their film takes place over multiple time periods simultaneously. It's a more contemplative film than most MCU productions, concerned with geological time rather than tactical time. What If's Season 3 version takes that framework and applies the series' signature premise to it. What if one element of the Eternals story went differently? The specific divergence hasn't been detailed in enough specifics pre-release, but the result apparently involves the Eternals in circumstances more explicitly tied to the multiverse architecture, as beings who've existed long enough to have encountered multiple branches of timeline, potentially, or whose role as protectors of emerging worlds puts them in a specific relationship to the multiverse tree that Loki is maintaining. The Season 3 finale, by virtue of being the finale for the entire What If project, faces a particular challenge. It has to be an ending for a show that's been structurally designed to not have endings. Each episode was supposed to be self-contained. Each universe was supposed to be its own complete thing. Bringing that to a genuine conclusion without betraying the anthology's essential nature requires threading a needle. From what's available, the approach seems to be the most honest one available. The Watcher's arc is the through line, and his arc is about learning what observation requires and costs. He began the series unable to interfere. He broke that rule when Infinity Stone Ultron forced his hand. He's been navigating the consequences of that break ever since. The Guardians of the Multiverse, Strange Supreme's containment, the various interventions that have followed. The finale gives him something to actually resolve, which an anthology character never quite gets. Resolution for an observer might look like acceptance rather than action, an acknowledgement that observation itself is a form of care, that bearing witness to things, all these universes, all these stories, all this variation, matters even when you can't intervene. There's something in that worth sitting with. The Watcher's function in the show is the viewer's function. We're all watching these stories, doing something like what he does, witnessing without the ability to affect the outcome, finding meaning in the observation itself. The multiverse in What If's animated form is ultimately a meditation on storytelling. Every universe is a story. Every divergence is a narrative choice. The Watcher is the person who holds all the stories in mind at once and cares about each of them. Not because he can affect them, but because they deserve to be cared about. That's a reasonable place for an anthology to end up. The Agatha Harkness episode of Season 3, the inclusion of which has been confirmed through the voice cast announcements, is interesting given the character's arc in live action. Agatha in WandaVision was revealed to be a centuries-old witch who manipulated Wanda's grief-constructed reality for her own purposes, and who was ultimately imprisoned inside a false identity by Wanda's magic. Agatha, all along, then followed her escape from that imprisonment and her navigation of a genuine witch's road, a magical gauntlet through alternate realities, in pursuit of restoring her own power. Agatha, in What If, could be any number of things. A version where her conflict with Wanda went differently. A version where her centuries of magical practice intersected with the multiverse in ways the live-action shows didn't explore. A version where she found the witch's road without the complications of WandaVision. The show hasn't specified, and the specifics are perhaps less important than the fact that Catherine Hahn's voice is on the project, which suggests that Agatha Harkness remains a character Marvel is interested in. The Moon Knight episode is similarly notable for being the character's first animated appearance, and for the specific weirdness that Moon Knight brings to any story he's in. Mark Spector, Stephen Grant, and whatever other identities share their skull are already operating at a remove from consensus reality. The question of what If does with a character whose relationship with reality is already genuinely complicated is one of Season 3's more intriguing open questions. The Disney acquisition of Fox in 2019 created a situation that had no real precedent in film history. A studio suddenly owning the rights to decades of another studio's superhero films, all of which featured characters that technically belong to the same fictional universe as the new studio's own productions. The X-Men films, the Deadpool films, the original Fantastic Four films, The Daredevil film? Ghost Rider. 20 years of Marvel characters who'd been developed, portrayed, grown, killed, and beloved by different people under different conditions. What do you do with all of that? The MCU's answer, developed gradually and then committed to with Deadpool and Wolverine, is that you fold it in. It all happened. It happened in a different universe. Earth 1005 is the designation that gets used for the Fox X-Men continuity. But it happened. The people who lived those stories are real variants. Their histories are real histories. The decades of films are a universe. Earth 1005 is a world where mutants exist openly and have been fighting for recognition since at least the 1960s, which honestly puts them a few decades ahead of Earth 616's current situation, where the question of powered people and governance is still being argued about in committees. Charles Xavier built his school. Magneto shaped a generation of conflict between humans and mutants, and occasionally fought on the same side as the X-Men, when the threat was large enough to make old arguments feel small. Jean Grey was the Phoenix. Logan was everywhere, with everyone, in everything, seemingly always adjacent to the most important moments. The specific timeline of the Fox films is famously complicated. The Days of Future Past reset created a branch that contradicted earlier films, and the subsequent films weren't entirely consistent about what the post-reset history looked like. But the broad strokes are a universe of mutant history, decades of it, with all the texture and tragedy that implies. Logan's universe, the one from which the worst Wolverine variant in Deadpool and Wolverine comes, is a specific branch within this that developed in its own terrible direction. In this universe, Logan was supposed to be the leader of the X-Men. He failed them, not through lack of power or lack of courage, but through the specific kind of emotional unavailability that's been Logan's particular damage since the Weapon X program. He was there without being present, capable of love, without being able to express or sustain it. The X-Men died, every member, not from some external threat that overpowered them, but from Logan's failure to hold them together, to be the leader they needed him to be. The weight of that is what made this version of Logan choose to drink himself into oblivion in a dead universe rather than try to be anything for anyone again. Wade Wilson's universe, meanwhile, is facing a different kind of ending, not catastrophic collapse but slow erasure. The anchor being of Wade's timeline, the Logan of his universe, is dead. Without an anchor being, the TVA marks the timeline for pruning. Everyone in it ceases to exist when the pruning happens. Not with drama, just with not being anymore. Wade's response is to go find another Wolverine. His search through the multiverse, glimpsed briefly in the film's opening act, takes him through several alternate realities before he finds the worst Wolverine, drunk and despairing in what used to be his universe. The Void's population of Fox-era characters is where the film does something quietly moving. Blade, Gambit, Elektra, Laura, all versions of characters, from timelines that were pruned, all ended up in the same wasteland, all found each other. Gambit is absolutely charming in the 12 minutes he gets on screen, which is both the joy and the frustration of his appearance. He was always right there in the comics. He finally made it into a film at the worst possible time. What this section of the MCU's multiverse represents, ultimately, is a decision about history. The Fox films existed. The people who made them, who starred in them, who grew up loving them, that history is real, even if the in-universe history of Earth 1005 is fictional. Folding those universes into the MCU multiverse is a way of acknowledging that history rather than simply replacing it. Patrick Stewart as Professor Xavier in Earth 838, Hugh Jackman's Logan showing up in Wade's story, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield standing beside Tom Holland. These are genuine acts of narrative generosity, a storytelling franchise saying, all of that counted. It all goes on the tree. Earth 1005 is out there somewhere, its history intact, its stories filed under things that happened in this particular branch. And Loki is holding that branch open, the same as all the others. Earth 828 is the most visually distinct universe in the live-action MCU. The moment the film opens on its version of 1964, something is different. The retrofuturism is deliberate and specific. Hover vehicles, googie architecture, optimistic geometry, a world that genuinely believed the future was going to be clean and bright and full of chrome. This is a universe that got the science right, or closer to right, faster than ours did. The level of technological development visible in the background of the film's Earth scenes suggests a 1964 that's further along than any realistic 1964 could be, which is the point. This universe's history developed differently, not in ways the film specifies in detail, but in ways you can infer from the look of the thing. Somewhere, something happened that accelerated the pace of human progress. Reed Richards and Sue Storm and Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm have been famous for 4 years by the time the film opens. Not controversial, not feared, not the subjects of governance hearings and public anxiety. Famous, celebrated. The world knows them, welcomes them, throws parties for the anniversary of their transformation. There's something almost poignant about that, relative to the MCU's Earth 616. The Avengers of Earth 616 are heroes, but also frequent subjects of public debate, UN oversight attempts, Sokovia Accords, general suspicion. The Fantastic Four of Earth 828 are loved. It's a universe that decided to embrace its extraordinary people rather than legislate them. Sue Storm's pregnancy adds a domestic weight to the cosmic stakes that the film handles well. She's the most powerful member of the team, capable of generating force fields of almost unlimited strength, and she's also expecting a child in a world that's about to face an existential threat. The film doesn't pretend that's a simple thing to navigate. Reed Richards in this universe is the idealist scientist archetype in its most complete form. The man who genuinely believes that any problem has a solution if you think about it hard enough and long enough. His plan to move the entire planet Earth to a different solar system, to literally relocate 8 billion people and one planet through quantum tunnels to escape Galactus, is the kind of solution only a man with complete faith in human ingenuity would even propose. The fact that it nearly works is the film's statement about that faith. Galactus, as realised here, deserves a paragraph of its own. The MCU's first film attempt at the character, in the Fox-era Fantastic Four films, reduced Galactus to a cloud, which satisfied nobody. Earth 828's version goes the opposite direction. Galactus is vast in a way that the film's scale conveys by keeping him at the edge of the frame, or by contrasting him with objects whose size we already know. You never quite see all of him at once, and that's the right decision. Something that large should resist comprehension. He's not a villain in any meaningful sense. He's a force of nature with needs, and no particular concern for whether those needs are convenient for other forms of life. His offer to spare Earth if the Fantastic Four surrender their newborn son, Franklin, who he can sense carries the power cosmic in quantities that would satisfy his hunger for years, is presented without malice. It's a transaction. He's not trying to hurt them. He just needs to eat. The impossibility of that offer is where the film lives for most of its second half. Galactus isn't wrong that Franklin could save billions of lives. The Fantastic Four aren't wrong that surrendering their child is simply not something they're capable of doing, regardless of the arithmetic. Shalabal, the Silver Surfer in this universe, is the film's most complex character. She's not, in the end, what she appears to be. She's a scientist from Zenla, who made a sacrifice identical in structure to what Galactus is asking the Fantastic Four to make. She gave up her daughter, her life, her freedom to become his herald, in order to spare her own world. Every planet she condemns to feed him echoes the choice she made. She lives with that. She'd have died with it. if Johnny Storm hadn't looked closely enough to see past the silver surface to the person underneath. Her final act, pushing Galactus through the dimensional portal and going through with him, closing it behind her, is the film's biggest sacrifice, and the film is honest about what it costs. It's not triumphant, it's just the thing she chose to do. Earth 828 survives its apocalypse with its optimism largely intact. The Fantastic Four's world still believes in science and collaboration, and the fundamental goodness of human ingenuity. It's a universe that faced Galactus and managed against all reasonable odds to still be standing afterward. That feels like a particular kind of miracle in a franchise that deals in them. The quantum realm doesn't fit neatly into the multiverse structure, which is appropriate, given that it doesn't fit neatly into anything. One of the Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania screenwriters described it as the basement of the multiverse, the sublevel, the connective infrastructure, the space that exists beneath all the other spaces. It's not a universe in the sense that Earth 616 or Earth 838 are universes. It doesn't have its own Earth or its own sky or its own history in the usual sense. It's a dimension accessed by going very, very small, and what you find when you get there is stranger than anyone expected. Janet Van Dyne spent 30 years in the quantum realm after sacrificing herself to stop a nuclear missile, going subatomic to disable it, unable to get back out without PIM particles she didn't have. 30 years in a dimension with no natural exit. The films don't dwell too long on what that was like, but the shape of it is present in the way Janet moves through the events of Quantumania, a woman who adapted to impossibility because she had no other option, who learned the rules of a place that shouldn't sustain life, who came back changed in ways she finds difficult to fully articulate. She also met Kang there, which is the quantum realm's most consequential fact. Kang the Conqueror, not He Who Remains, not any of the named variants, but this specific version, was exiled to the quantum realm by the Council of Kangs. The reasoning isn't detailed explicitly in the film, but the implication is that this variant was dangerous in ways that even a council of multiversal conquerors found excessive. They sent him somewhere they thought he couldn't cause damage. He built an empire there. With Janet's help at first, she assisted him in repairing the technology that would let him leave, not understanding what it was. And then alone, using decades of rage and intelligence and resources, he turned the quantum realm into the Kang realm. He built cities, he built an army, he built Modok, which is what happens when you take a person and make them interface directly with technology in ways no human body was designed to interface. He ruled the civilizations that existed in the quantum realm with the absolute authority of a man who decided the universe owed him everything. The quantum realm's internal scale is one of the conceptual oddities that the films gesture at but don't fully resolve. From outside, it's subatomic. You access it by shrinking past the Planck scale. From inside, it's enormous. There are cities, there are ecosystems, there's a sky, such as it is. The physics of that discrepancy are not explained and probably can't be explained in a way that holds up, but it's the kind of thing that's more interesting to accept than to interrogate. What the quantum realm contributes to the multiverse structure is something specific. It's the place where the consequences of multiversal interference accumulate. The Council of Kangs exists because He Who Remains existed, because Kang existed, because variant after variant of the same figure developed across different universes and eventually found each other. The quantum realm is where one of those variants was imprisoned. When Scott Lang kills him, it's not a resolution, it's a notification. The council receives the news that their exiled member is dead and reacts the way you'd expect a gathering of infinitely ambitious multiversal conquerors to react. They convene, they plan, they prepare. The post-credits scene of Quantumania, dozens of Kang variants in an enormous arena, all furious about the same death, is one of the more effectively ominous things the MCU has done. Each of those variants is, in their own universe, a conqueror of enormous power. Together, they're something with no real ceiling on what they're capable of. That convergence is the quantum realm's lasting contribution to the Multiverse Saga. Not just a place Scott Lang visited and fought in, but the gathering point for the franchise's next great threat. The civilizations inside the quantum realm are one of Quantumania's more interesting background details, and the film doesn't quite have time to give them the attention they deserve. There are people who have lived in the quantum realm for generations, not castaways or exiles, people born there, raised there, with their own history and mythology and sense of the world. They've developed cultures and technologies adapted to an environment that operates by different physical rules. They have cities built in the folds between matter. They have their own understanding of what the quantum realm is and what it means. Most of them, by the time Scott Lang arrives, are under Kangs' authority. Modoki, Darren Cross from the first Ant-Man film, who ended up in the quantum realm after his defeat, and was reshaped there into something difficult to categorize as either human or machine, enforces that authority with particular enthusiasm. He is in some ways the most pathetic figure in Quantumania, a man transformed so thoroughly by circumstance that his original self is only barely detectable, still motivated by the same wounded pride that drove him in the first place. The freedom fighters are the people who've decided Kang's authority ends where they choose to stop accepting it. Gentora and her companions have built a resistance in the quantum realm's less accessible spaces, surviving through mobility and the kind of knowledge that comes from living in a place your enemies don't understand as well as you do. Their fight is the kind that doesn't make it into history books, ongoing, grinding, without decisive victories, sustained by the choice to keep going rather than by any realistic expectation of winning. When Scott and his family arrive and disrupt Kang's plans, it's the freedom fighters who benefit most directly. Their world changes because outsiders with no stake in it, no particular reason to get involved, decided that getting involved was the right thing to do. That's a Spider-Man kind of morale, transplanted to a dimension accessed through particle physics. The quantum realm's relationship to time is the other genuinely strange thing about it. Janet Van Dyne describes it as existing outside of normal spacetime, which is technically consistent with its description as the basement of the multiverse. If the multiverse is a building, and we've been using that analogy tonight, so let's commit to it, the quantum realm is the basement in the sense that it runs beneath all the floors, connecting them without being any of them. This has implications for travel and for causality. Things that happen in the quantum realm have effects that can propagate in ways that don't respect the normal rules about before and after. This is part of why the Avengers were able to use it for the time heist in Endgame. The physics of the space can be exploited to access different temporal coordinates in the regular universe if you understand it well enough and have sufficient Pym particles. Kang understood it well enough. He understood it better than almost anyone, which is part of why the quantum realm became his domain rather than his prison. Scott's understanding is more intuitive than scientific. He follows the logic of what needs to happen rather than the equations of how it's possible, which is not a bad way to operate in a dimension where the equations don't quite apply. Incursions. The word gets introduced in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness somewhat quietly, and it earns more consideration than it usually gets, because it's one of the genuinely unsettling ideas at the heart of the multiverse architecture. An incursion is what happens when two universes collide, not metaphorically, literally. Two realities occupying the same space, overlapping, pressing against each other, until one or both of them are destroyed. The cause is usually a person moving between universes too often, or using magic to traverse the multiverse in ways that destabilize the barriers between realities. The effect is the death of an entire universe, possibly two. Earth 838's Illuminati killed a version of Doctor Strange, a variant who came to their universe seeking help against Thanos, because his use of the Darkhold while traversing the multiverse had already caused one incursion, an entire universe destroyed because of choices one person made while traveling between realities. The Illuminati's decision to execute him was monstrous in its method and arguably defensible in its reasoning, which is the uncomfortable space the MCU keeps placing its most interesting moral questions. The incursion threat connects directly to the Council of Kangs, because the Council represents an incursion of a different kind. Every Kang variant is, in their own universe, potentially a universe-threatening force. When they cooperate, the combined weight of infinite conquerors, all making the same decisions, is the kind of pressure that the multiverse's structure wasn't designed to withstand. He Who Remains understood this. It's why he ran the TVA, not just to prevent one Kang from emerging, but to prevent the conditions in which Kangs find each other, recognize each other, and start coordinating. The moment Sylvie kills He Who Remains, she removes the mechanism that kept this from happening. The multiverse opens, the Kang variants multiply and connect, and the council that was already meeting in secret starts meeting in public. Ramatut, Immortus, Centurion. These are three of the named variants who appear in the Quantumania post-credits scene. They have their own histories in the comics, their own distinct trajectories through time and the multiverse. In the MCU, they're members of a council that has apparently been operating across the multiverse for longer than the sacred timeline existed, and they're very much not pleased about what's happened to one of their number in the quantum realm. The threat they represent isn't any single Kang but the pattern. Kang as a recurring figure, not a villain but a type, a shape that the multiverse generates in certain conditions over and over and over. Every universe that produces a sufficiently brilliant, sufficiently damaged, sufficiently ambitious person with access to time travel technology eventually produces a Kang. The sacred timeline suppressed this. Without suppression, the pattern reasserts itself. What comes next, Avengers, Doomsday, Secret Wars, is the franchise working towards some kind of resolution to the incursion problem, the specific shape of which Marvel has been careful not to spell out. But the direction is clear enough. More universes, more pressure on the barriers between them, more of the multiverse tree coming into contact with itself. The comic book version of Secret Wars, both of them, the 1984 version and the 2015 version, involved the literal collision of realities and the construction of a patchwork world from the pieces. The MCU's version will presumably do something adjacent, if not identical. The exact mechanics don't matter much for tonight. What matters is the direction. The multiverse that was closed and controlled under He Who Remains is now open. Open means the threat of incursion. Open means the Council of Kangs. Open means infinite possible stories and infinite possible catastrophes. The tree that Loki is holding has more branches than it can comfortably sustain, and some of those branches are going to collide. There's an argument that He Who Remains was right, that the cost of an open multiverse, the incursions, the Kangs, the instability, is too high for the benefit of infinite stories playing out. That pruning timelines, horrible as it is, prevents something worse. The MCU doesn't seem interested in adjudicating that argument, which is probably the right choice. These things don't resolve. They just continue in all their complicated, contradictory, infinite variation. The incursion concept is one of the MCU's most genuinely frightening multiversal implications, and it's worth sitting with why. Most multiverse threats involve a specific actor, a Kang variant, a Scarlet Witch, an Ultron that's too successful. They have agency and motivation, and can, in theory, be stopped by the right combination of heroes with the right combination of abilities. The threat is real, but comprehensible. Incursions are different because they're structural. They don't require anyone to make a bad decision or harbour a bad intention. They just require enough movement between universes, enough bending of the barriers between realities, and eventually, two of those realities press together with enough force that one or both collapse. Nobody is to blame. except insofar as everyone who's ever travelled between universes is cumulatively to blame. In a franchise that has now produced multiple films in which the heroes solve their problem by travelling through the multiverse, Spider-Man, No Way Home, Endgame's Time Heist, Doctor Strange 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, this is a mildly uncomfortable implication. Every trip is a small contribution to the incursion risk. Every solved problem adds a fraction of pressure to the barriers. Earth 838's Illuminati were aware of this. Their execution of the Darkhold using Strange variant was, within their moral framework, an act of self-defense on behalf of their universe. He had already triggered one incursion. The probability that he'd trigger another was high enough, in their estimation, to outweigh whatever rights a visitor from another universe might have. They were wrong to do what they did, or at least the method was wrong, but the logic of why isn't entirely dismissible. The Avengers. Secret War's premise, which the franchise is clearly building toward, involves this concept at its largest scale. If incursions have been happening across the multiverse, and given everything we've seen they must be, then the cumulative damage to the barriers between realities would eventually produce a situation where multiple universes are pressing against each other simultaneously. A crisis not of one actor's making, but of the multiverse's own weight. The comic book version involved a character named the Molecule Man as a specific trigger, and Reed Richards as the person who had to figure out how to reassemble existence from the pieces afterward. The MCU version will presumably adapt this in ways that make sense for the characters and actors it has available. What matters tonight, for our purposes, is the feeling of it. The sense that all these universes we've been visiting, Earth 838, the what-if worlds, the Fox universe, the quantum realm civilizations, are all pressing up against each other, held apart by increasingly thin barriers, watched over by a man at the end of time who is holding the branches open with everything he has. It's a lot to sustain. The multiverse is a lot to sustain. Loki knows this. He sits with it anyway. There's a category of multiverse-adjacent space that doesn't fit comfortably into the alternate Earth designation and doesn't quite belong with the clearly distinct universes either. These are the pocket dimensions, the sealed-off spaces, the places that exist alongside our reality without being other versions of it. They're less alternate universes than rooms in a much larger building, accessible, contained, functional, but not independent. The mirror dimension is probably the most used tool in a sorcerer's kit, and honestly, it's a bit mundane relative to everything else on this list, which is sort of the point. A pocket reality that overlays our own, separated like a glass box. You can have entire battles in there, fold reality into impossible shapes, and the real world doesn't feel a thing. The visual signature, that fractal folding architecture, buildings rotating into impossible configurations, has become the shorthand for MCU magic, which is interesting given that the mirror dimension is essentially a practical tool rather than a dramatic location. It's not where the interesting things happen. It's where the cleanup happens, the contained conflict, the managed danger. The magical equivalent of an airbag. The astral dimension already came up in the Doctor Strange section, and it keeps appearing across the MCU in ways that suggest it's more central to the franchise's mythology than it gets credit for. It appears in Doctor Strange, in WandaVision's examination of Wanda's powers, in Avengers, Endgame's snap sequences. It's not a place anyone chooses to go for long. It's the dimension where consciousness briefly exists, independent of body, and most people who end up there return quickly. The exceptions tend to involve either tremendous magical ability or tremendous necessity. The dark dimension is different from these. It's genuinely alien, genuinely hostile, and genuinely ruled by something with its own agenda. Dormammu's realm doesn't mirror our world. It replaces the concept of physics with Dormammu's will. Time doesn't function there. Matter behaves oddly. The visual production design, churning energy, vast churning distances, no stable ground, is the MCU at its most genuinely strange. The Shadow Realm from Thor, Love and Thunder occupies similar space. Gorr the God Butcher uses it to hide the abducted Asgardian children, and what we see of it is quieter than Dormammu's dimension. Dark, twisted, organic, shaped by the Necrosword's influence, rather than by any autonomous will. It's a tool more than a place. Gorr created it as a holding space, and it feels like one, contained, purposeful in a grim way. Sakaar is a peculiar case, the Grandmaster's world, the one Thor ends up on in Ragnarok, the one Tony Stark ends up on in the What If Season 2 universe, where he doesn't come back through the portal, functions as a genuine location with its own culture, but it receives its population from across the multiverse via wormholes. Objects, people, ships, all of it falls through spatial anomalies and lands on Sakaar. It's less a universe than a terminus, a place where things from other places accumulate. There's something almost cozy about Sakaar relative to the dark dimension, or the void. It's chaotic and violent, and governed by an eccentric tyrant with control issues, but it's alive. It has markets and communities and gladiatorial spectacle that, by its own cultural logic, is entertainment. People have lives there, they've built things. The Sakaarians who've been there long enough don't particularly want to leave. The pocket within a pocket dimensions glimpsed throughout the MCU, the soul world inside the Soul Stone, the void space where Tony meets an older Morgan after the snap, are the most intimate. They're not locations exactly. They're more like mental spaces rendered physical, places that exist because a sufficiently powerful artifact or being generated them. They follow the logic of their creators rather than the logic of physics. The soul world in particular is strange to think about. Half the universe's life spent 5 years inside a soul gem, in a space that had no particular relationship with time or physical need. When Hulk snapped them back, they returned from somewhere. From that pocket, from that orange-lit, strange, gentle space. They don't remember it, typically, but they were somewhere. All of these spaces, the mirror dimension, the dark dimension, the shadow realm, the soul world, the astral plane, constitute a kind of invisible geography. They're around us, in the MCU's logic, layered alongside reality, accessible with the right tools or the right catastrophe. Most people in Earth 616 go their whole lives without encountering any of them directly. The Watcher can see all of them from his observatory, which is, I think, the right note to end on for this section. The multiverse isn't just the alternate Earths and branching timelines. It's all the spaces in between. The gaps, the pockets, the rooms that don't have addresses but still exist, the places that only certain people ever find under certain conditions, and that most of the universe will never know about. They're there though, all of it's there, real and present, and part of the same enormous structure that Loki is holding open at the end of time. One thing that gets overlooked in discussions of the MCU's multiversal geography is the role of the 3 Sanctums as a kind of infrastructure. There are 3 of them: New York, London, Hong Kong. Each one sits at a point where the barriers between dimensions are naturally thin, places where the geography of our universe presses close to the geography of other dimensions, for reasons the films don't fully specify, but that seem connected to ley lines, energy convergences, the accumulated weight of magical practice in that location over centuries. The Sanctums are less buildings than anchors. They maintain the stability of the barriers they're built on top of. When Caecilius destroys the Hong Kong Sanctum in the first Doctor Strange film, the effect is immediate and dramatic. The dark dimension begins bleeding into our reality at that location, the barrier failing without the anchor. Strange reverses time locally to restore it, which is one of the more creative uses of the Time Stone in the films. Not using it to win a fight, but using it to undo architectural damage before it becomes cosmological damage. The Sanctum's existence suggests that Earth 616 has particular vulnerabilities in its multiversal position, places where it's exposed to other dimensions in ways other planets apparently aren't. Whether this is natural to Earth's specific position in the multiverse, or whether it's a consequence of thousands of years of magical practice attracting and creating these thin spots, is unclear. What is clear is that they require protection. The masters of the mystic arts have been providing that protection for centuries, which says something about how old the problem is, and how long humans have been quietly managing it. Strange becomes the Sorcerer Supreme of Earth 616 by the end of his first film, which means the responsibility for all three Sanctums and all the barrier maintenance they represent falls to him specifically. That's an enormous weight for one person, even a person of his abilities. It's part of why Wong's role in subsequent films isn't just comic relief. He's genuinely essential to the infrastructure. The existence of alternate universe Sanctums is something the franchise implies but doesn't explore deeply. Earth 8008 presumably has its own equivalent, maintained by Christine Palmer's Baxter Foundation, and whatever mystical tradition exists in that universe. The what-if universes presumably have variants of the Sanctums, some functional, some not, depending on what happened to the sorcerers who would have protected them. In Strange Supreme's destroyed universe, the New York Sanctum is presumably rubble, along with everything else. The masters of the mystic arts have been quietly holding that line for longer than most people realize. We've spent a lot of tonight talking about universes that exist in the official multiverse, alternate Earths with their own independent histories, branches from the sacred timeline that developed in their own direction. But WandaVision creates something slightly different, a pocket reality constructed inside an existing universe. Westview, New Jersey doesn't become an alternate Earth, it remains Earth 616. But Wanda's grief and her chaos magic and the unusual psychic resonance of that particular town, all its citizens harbouring decades of suppressed misery that Wanda's magic could draw on, combine to create something unprecedented. The Hex, a bubble reality inside our reality, where the rules are different, where time is expressed through television aesthetics, where vision is alive, and the twins exist and Wanda is happy. It's not sustainable. Monica Rambeau figures out fairly quickly that the people inside it are real people living real lives inside a fiction they didn't consent to, and the gradual revelation of this fact is what drives WandaVision from cozy nostalgia television to something more genuinely uncomfortable. The Hex as a concept connects to the multiverse in one specific way. When Wanda destroys it, she experiences what it means to lose a world she built. She experiences loss of the specific kind that the multiverse deals in. Entire realities, entire populations of people you love, gone. The children she loses when the Hex comes down are within that reality as real as any alternate universe children. Their deaths are, in whatever sense these things can be real, genuine. The Darkhold's exploitation of that loss is the engine of Multiverse of Madness. It finds the specific wound that WandaVision created and presses on it until Wanda's willing to do anything. Travel to alternate universes, destroy whatever's in her path, commit essentially every kind of violence, to find a world where those children exist and she can be with them. The Hex is, in this reading, the MCU's thesis statement about the multiverse in miniature. A created reality is real to the people inside it. The loss of it is real loss, and the desire to recover it, if not properly understood and accepted, becomes the engine of extraordinary destruction. Wanda's arc from WandaVision through Multiverse of Madness is the clearest illustration in the franchise of what happens when someone treats the multiverse as a solution to grief rather than as a separate set of realities with their own people in them. The alternate Wandas she would have displaced to get to her children are people. Their children would still have had mothers, just not her. The math of that doesn't resolve in anyone's favour. Here is a thing that's genuinely difficult to hold in mind for any sustained period. The multiverse in the MCU's telling is actually infinite, not large in the way that the universe is large, the kind of large that astronomers describe with numbers that make sense in isolation, but cease to register as comprehensible quantities when stacked against human experience, infinite in the mathematical sense. Every possible divergence produces a branch. Every branch that's allowed to develop produces every possible divergence from that branch, and so on, recursively, without limit. The what-if universes are not a complete catalogue of alternate realities. They're a selection, 9 or 10 per season, curated by the watcher, presented to us as examples of the kind of thing that's out there. The actual number of universes in which someone other than Steve Rogers got the serum is, within the logic of the franchise, infinite. Infinite universes where Peggy got it, infinite where Howard got it, infinite where the scientist got it, infinite where a random bystander walking past the facility got it, all of them developing in their own completely distinct directions from that single altered moment. The TVA was managing this by preventing it, pruning everything that diverged, compressing infinite possibility into a controlled quantity. Since Sylvie killed He Who Remains, that's gone. And Loki, as we discussed earlier, is what's holding it open now. It's an enormous thing to sit with. The idea that somewhere in all that infinite structure, every version of every story is playing out completely. Every good ending that didn't happen in one universe happened in another. Every loss that was irreversible here was reversible somewhere else. Loki holds it open. The watcher keeps watching. The map is vast and it never really ends. So that's the shape of it, more or less. Infinite universes, each one branching from a single point. A decision made differently. An accident that didn't happen. A variable that came out the other way. Some of them are worlds we'd recognize immediately, just slightly off. Some of them are so different from anything we know that the word world barely covers what they are. All of them are real within the logic of this particular fiction. All of them are being held open by one man at the centre of a tree that fills all of time. There's something genuinely calming about that, I find. Not the idea that things could go differently, that's the opposite of calming usually, but the idea that every version of every story is somewhere playing out completely. Every version of Tony Stark and Steve Rogers and Peggy Carter, every version of Wanda's children, every version of Peter Parker catching the person he couldn't save in his own universe. The multiverse, in the MCU's telling, is less a source of chaos than a source of completeness. Nothing's missing. Every possibility is real somewhere. The watcher gets to see all of it. I've got more MCU content planned. The history of the Kang variants individually. A proper deep dive on Loki's timeline that we only grazed tonight. The individual Doctor Strange films in more detail than we got to here. Things to look forward to on quieter evenings. But for tonight, that's the whole map. Every universe we know about. Visited in turn, no particular hurry. The watcher's still out there, presumably. Still watching. All those windows,